1968. The nation was at war, not only against the Vietnamese in Southeast Asia, but also with itself. Americans were protesting against the war, against racism, and against what some saw as the fundamental values of American society.
The election that played out that year, with its encounters between the establishment and radical elements of the Democratic Party, and the exchange of new and often radical ideas about government and policy, reshaped American politics and gave us the political landscape we know today. For the better part of 3 decades, the Democratic Party effectively controlled the levers of power nationwide. Ever since Franklin Roosevelt's landslide victory in 1932, the New Deal coalition, a coming together of industry and labor, of Southerners and minorities, of the poor and intellectuals, had propelled the Democrats to victory in the vast majority of local, state, and federal elections. One of these New Deal Democrats was President Lyndon Johnson, who had assumed office after the assassination of President Kennedy. After rising to the presidency, he galvanized the country by passing legislation that Kennedy had pushed for with his new frontier ideas.
His liberal ideas were put into effect early on in his presidency, as he attempted to create what he called the Great Society, which was a more modern version of Roosevelt's New Deal and a continuation of Kennedy's New Frontier, defining measures like Medicare, food stamps, and the Clean Air Act.
While many measures passed overwhelmingly, others were more controversial. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, more than anything, caused major discontent among Southerners who had defended segregation. Even as Johnson won in a landslide in 1964, the Deep South voted Republican for the first time since Reconstruction a century before. But the war had become all-consuming, both fiscally and politically. The war was becoming the biggest issue, and was the most major policy of Kennedy's that Johnson embraced. 500,000 soldiers were in Vietnam by 1968, and the casualty reports on the nightly news did nothing to help the case for the war. With President Johnson's approval rating sagging, there were whispers of primary challenges. One of the first candidates was Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy.
McCarthy was able to harness the influence of the anti-war movement to his advantage, mobilizing young people as campaign volunteers. However, even concerns about the war did not seem to be enough to unseat Johnson. While there was support for ending the war, the public remained divided, and the administration still maintained that the war was winnable.
January 30th, 1968. Any sense of American momentum surrounding the war came to a crashing halt during the Tet Offensive. During what was supposed to be a ceasefire to celebrate the Lunar New Year, the North Vietnamese launched a massive attack on over 100 targets across the country. Despite repelling all the attacks and inflicting 10 times as many casualties as they suffered, the media began to paint the war as unwinnable, with images of enemy soldiers breaching the American embassy's walls plastered on television screens the nation over. Public support for the war cratered. For the first time, Gallup found that a majority of Americans thought sending U.S. troops was a mistake. McCarthy seized on this momentum as the first primary election approached. March 12th, New Hampshire voted, and the result was telling. President Johnson had failed to win a majority of the vote, only narrowly beating McCarthy 48-42. College-age McCarthy volunteers had been crisscrossing the state for months, and their efforts had paid off.
Deny and postpone the demands of our own people while spending billions in the name of freedom elsewhere around the globe. No nation can exert greater influence or power in the world than it can exercise over the streets of its own capital. And I think we have to recognize that as well.
Because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men.
With blood in the political water, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, brother of the slain president, entered the race. Through his speeches and his seizing of his brother's legacy, he sought to unify the Democratic Party and mend the cracks that were beginning to form in the New Deal coalition. By the time the month was out, President Johnson had withdrawn from the race. Votes had barely been cast, but the nation's political landscape had already shifted dramatically in the first few months of the year. It was not clear who the Democratic establishment would coalesce around.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
4 days after Johnson withdrew, the nation was once again turned on its head. Reverend Martin Luther King, the famed civil rights leader, was shot while in Memphis. The nation erupted, with riots breaking out in nearly every major city, except Indianapolis, where Senator Kennedy delivered the news and called for unity. The King assassination blew the top off of race relations that had gradually worsened throughout the decade. The government had struggled to enforce the Civil Rights Act to stamp out segregation and discrimination, and was continually encountering pushback from Southerners. Even as the debate shifted from being over segregation and Jim Crow to issues like urban poverty, crime, and desegregation busing, many issues were still being cast in clearly racial terms. Increasingly, it seemed as though there were no longer room for both blacks and white Southerners in the Democratic Party, with groups like the Black Panthers pushing for more aggressive action and Southerners flocking to the third-party George Wallace candidacy. The New Deal coalition was fracturing.
Further complicating matters was the entry of Vice President Hubert Humphrey into the race as a candidate for the establishment.
Tuesday night was a particularly joyous night. Robert Francis Kennedy was 42 years old and had just won the victory of his political life in the California presidential primary. He spoke to his supporters, heard their cheers, and invited them to Chicago. Senator Kennedy was a very happy man as he made his way out of the crowd into the hotel kitchen, into the range of a young, swarthy assailant. The senator was hit by 2 bullets. 5 other persons were also wounded as bullets sprayed the kitchen.
June 6th. Just as suddenly as he entered the race, Bobby Kennedy was shot and killed after winning the California primary. With the party's chances at unification circling the drain, Democrats nervously awaited the Chicago convention in August.
On August 26, Chicago Mayor Richard Daley rang in the 1968 Democratic National Convention amidst protests both in the city and on the convention floor. Over 30,000 people, many of them young leftists seeking an end to the war, clashed with police on the streets of Chicago. Other candidates, sensing disunity, entered their names, hoping to become sway party bosses and unpledged delegates from states where no voters had a say in their selection. Chaos broke out, with hardliners and moderates trading blows on live television. The Democratic Party had torn itself apart. Humphrey, who failed to win a single primary, was backed by unions, civil rights activists, and the Johnson administration. The young and intellectuals were largely boxed out of the party, their voice in the primaries ignored. Southerners supported George Wallace en masse, delivering him the South in the general election. In the general election, Vice President Richard Nixon consistently led Humphrey. While Humphrey often was torn as to which faction of his party to appease with his policies, Nixon had a clear message: peace with honor in Vietnam, and a promise to reinstate law and order in response to riots and radicalism. Nixon won decisively with the New Deal coalition in tatters. In doing so, he broke the Democratic lock on political power. That the political shocks and realignment that occurred in 1968 was the start of a new era in American politics. The bolting of Southern Democrats to Wallace foreshadowed their eventual movement to the Republican Party. Democrats no longer had a stranglehold on those states and their seats of power, a trend that progressed to the Republican Party's political lock on the South today.
After the debacle that was the Democratic primaries, there were calls for reform. Humphrey had won the nomination without winning a single of the 14 primaries. The McGovern-Fraser Commission was formed after the election and created the modern primary system that we know and participate in today. The new primary system placed control of the party's nominee in the heads of rank-and-file members and away from party bosses. The election of Richard Nixon did not resolve the issues facing the nation. The Vietnam War would not end for another 7 years, and racial tensions persist to this day. But the election of 1968 has the distinction of being truly modern, in the issues that were debated, the policies that were exchanged, and in the alignments of the parties and what they stood for. The Democrats and Republicans had become parties based around firm ideologies of liberalism and conservatism rather than ties of class and region. Each electoral encounter that followed, to this day, took place in the shadow of the clashes that happened that year.